every single mushroom, when you go into the supermarket and you see the mushrooms there, every single mushroom has been picked by hand.
Mm.
There is no machine harvesting of mushrooms. So the millions, billions of these mushrooms that go into the markets every year, they have been picked by hand. So it's very expensive. So
Welcome back to another episode of Plant-Based DFW, and this is Maya. Today's guest is Jeff Chilton. If you want to talk mushrooms, Jeff is your man. He has been growing, cultivating, and researching mushrooms since the late 60s. Holy shiitake, that is over 50 years of experience. In the late 70s, Jeff started Mycomedia, a company that organized educational mushroom conferences in the Pacific Northwest. During this time, Jeff also authored the critically acclaimed book titled The Mushroom Cultivator. Jeff took his extensive knowledge of mushrooms and created his current company, Nammex, which was the first to offer a line of certified organic mushroom extracts that are now used by many supplement companies. Jeff has devoted his entire adult life to mushrooms and their health benefits. But not only that, he's a really fun guy. Let's welcome Jeff Chilton.
Hi, Maya. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to have you as well. Let's start with your history in mushrooms. You've been working on this since the 60s.
Oh, yeah. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Seattle, and we've got mushrooms everywhere in the fall during the season. In fact, it's one of the best wild mushroom areas in the world because it's wet, the temperate type of climate. So I was able as a youngster to get out and do some mushroom hunting. And, my mushroom hunting is one of those activities where you're going out, you're walking through the woods. It's really beautiful. And if you find a mushroom that's let's say a choice edible, it's like finding treasure. So it's really exciting as a kid. And then when I went to university in the late 60s, I studied anthropology, but I also studied mycology, which is the study of fungi, of which mushrooms are a part of that. And, fungi have their own kingdom. So, it's like we're used to thinking of mushrooms, for example, as vegetables. Well, you know what? They're actually not a plant. They're not an animal. They have their own kingdom. They sit right in between. And mushrooms even share some attributes with us as humans. For example, plants have starch. Mushrooms have glycogen as their storage carbohydrate. And that's the same as what humans have. We have glycogen as a storage carbohydrate. Mushrooms also breathe much like we do. They take in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So they share some of the same attributes. And I studied the use of mushrooms as food in cultures in my anthropological studies, as medicines, and also for shamanic purposes. So I kind of covered the full range of mushrooms and cultures worldwide. And then when I was finished with the university, not knowing what to do with a degree in anthropology, I thought, well, I'd love to learn how to grow mushrooms. So I got a job at the only mushroom farm in Washington State, and I was there for the next 10 years.
Wonderful. How is it that one can identify which mushrooms are edible?
Well, you know what? There's no real test per se. It's more a matter of learning from somebody who is knowledgeable, who has, let's just say, been a mushroom hunter for many, many years. And there's certain specific mushrooms that are recognized as being choice edibles. So of the hundreds, thousands of different species that we might encounter when we go out walking through the woods, we key in on this, let's just say, subset of maybe 10 to 20 mushrooms as being, these are the ones we want to find. Because most mushrooms are actually edible, but that doesn't mean they taste good. So we're looking for the ones that please our palate. There aren't a lot of mushrooms that can actually be cultivated. In fact, in the world, there's probably 24 out of thousands of species that we cultivate, partially because those are the ones that taste so good, but also a lot of mushrooms will grow in conjunction in a relationship with a tree, which we call a symbiosis or a mycorrhiza. And without the tree, the mushroom won't grow. So we can't actually grow it because of that relationship. So, again, there's about 20 or so really choice edibles that we look for when we're out mushroom hunting.
I also recently was watching a documentary about truffles. I learned that it's absolutely difficult to cultivate out here in the States, and they mainly come from France, I think, and Italy as well.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I happened to be at a mushroom conference in 1979. It was an international mushroom conference that took place in southern France. And as part of this conference, we actually went out truffle hunting while we were there.
Oh my goodness.
Truffles are one of those species that I was talking about that grows in conjunction with trees, and without the trees, you're not going to find the truffles. So, and actually they now have been able to grow truffles on the roots of young trees, and they have actual tree plantations that do grow truffles. But what's really interesting about the truffle is that when we went out truffle hunting with the people that do it regularly in France, he had a very large pig on a leash. So he walked out in the forest, and the pig would sniff around as they walked, and then it would stop and start to kind of dig into an area. And that's basically because the pig was trained to find the truffles. And then he would be kind of pulled back, and the person that was walking with the pig would get down and kind of dig a little bit and pull up the truffle. They also had a very small French poodle that was also trained. And of course, you can imagine having a small poodle is much easier than walking around with a pig on a leash. And you know what's interesting about a truffle? The truffle has a very, very powerful flavor and odor, and that's why the dog or the pig can smell it. Even though it's underground, they can smell it because of that powerful odor.
Why is it that some people have this misconception that fungus can actually, like the mushrooms, can actually hurt our body?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure where that came from, but there are, and especially for us in the West, there have been kind of this, we call it mycophobia, which means fear of mushrooms. And that's the reason why up until recently, we only had one cultivated mushroom in our markets, whereas in Asia, they've got 10 or 15 different mushrooms in their food markets. So actually, I think, and I've never seen any evidence, of course, and humans have been eating mushrooms for thousands of years. And when you talk about, in the West, well, boy, in Europe, my goodness, I mean, the Europeans love mushrooms and have been eating mushrooms for the longest time. But when the U.S., I think, was colonized, and it was, a lot of British people who were not quite so enamored with mushrooms, and they kind of brought that fear with them to North America. So I think that's been part of it. And it's just really been in the last, I would say, 50 years, and especially in the last 20 years, that mushrooms have really come into their own as a high quality food. And let me just tell you something that's just kind of interesting, that when I went to work on the mushroom farm in 1973, and it was a very, very large mushroom farm. We grew 2 million pounds of the standard button mushroom on that farm. Well, what I learned was that classical Western nutritionists considered mushrooms to be a non-food. And the reason that they did was because mushrooms are very low in calories. So they thought, well, anything that doesn't have any calories is, what's the point, right? So they thought, okay, mushrooms are just a garnish or something you put in for flavor. But the thing is that mushrooms have anywhere from 20 to 40% protein. They're primarily made up of carbohydrates, but non-starch carbohydrates. The carbohydrates in mushrooms are actually carbohydrates that are slow acting. One of the carbohydrates is called mannitol. It's a very slow acting carb. Mushrooms are also very high in fiber. So they will be digested very slowly. They're not like, people who eat refined carbohydrates and how it just kind of explodes and you get this rush of blood sugar and then you get let down later. Mushrooms are not like that. So they're good amount of protein for what we would, let's just call a vegetable, even though they're not a vegetable. The other part about the carbohydrates is they have these compounds that make up 50% of their cell walls, and these compounds are called beta-glucans. And the beta-glucans are actually what make mushrooms medicinal. So although, for example, in my company, we sell mushroom extracts where we will process them a bit and concentrate them. When you eat mushrooms, you are still going to be getting these beta-glucans. So I look at mushrooms as a food, as medicine. And let's face it, that our diet is the foundation of our health. We're looking to bring into our diet plants or whatever food stuff that actually can provide us with nutrition almost in a medicinal way, because without a good diet you're not going to have good health. So mushrooms are a really high quality food. I encourage people all the time, bring mushrooms into your diet. I actually consider mushrooms to be the missing link in our diet.
No kidding. How are your extracts used?
Well, here's what's interesting about mushrooms is that not only have they been used as food in Asia and worldwide, actually, for thousands and thousands of years, but in Asia, in the system traditional Chinese medicine, they actually found that certain mushrooms were potent medicines, and so they brought, and they have various mushrooms in their formulas in traditional Chinese medicine. And the real key to this gets back to the beta-glucan and the fact that what it will do is it will potentiate our immune system. So it will strengthen our immune system. So what we do is we grow the mushroom, we will dry it out, we will then cook it in hot water, very large tanks, think of it almost like making a soup. And then we will concentrate that fluid down, and we will take that liquid, which is now almost like a syrup, plus all of that mushroom fiber, which is a powder. We will send it to a dryer. It will be dried into a powder. And then our customers primarily put that mushroom extract into capsules, into bottles with their brand and label on it, and then it gets sold in health food stores.
Are you considered like the main provider of North America?
Well, you know what? We're one of we're probably the biggest provider of mushroom extracts that are certified organic and verified with scientific testing. We're probably the major supplier for that type of mushroom product, and we have hundreds and hundreds of customers that are putting out our powdered extracts into their products and selling it in the stores across the United States.
You touched on the word organic, which is something that I've heard you talk about before when asked whether we should choose organic or not organic mushrooms. And you talked about it, your experience at one time having, worked the area and witnessing that there was a lot of heavy spraying going on.
The thing is, let's face it, the food system worldwide I mean, I was just reading about all the chemicals that get sprayed in the United States, and it was just like, because it was talking kind of about the effect on our waterways and how all these agricultural chemicals, whether it be um, fertilizers or pesticides or fungicides or even this chemical Roundup. I mean, it's like the number of chemicals that we consume in our food, we don't even have any idea of how many of those chemicals that we're consuming these
Mhm.
days because there's so many of them. So when I look at food, I'm like, I want just the essence of you. I want you to be as clean as possible. I want you to be grown out of real dirt. And if you're a mushroom, I want you to be grown on sawdust because you normally grow on wood. So I want you to either be grown on a log or sawdust, but I want you to be grown on what you grow on naturally, and I want you to be grown in a way that does not use chemicals. So as somebody who truly believes in that, that was one of the things that I in my company decided way back in the 90s. I mean, my company was started in 1989 at a time, Maya, at a time when no herbal company had mushrooms in their product line, and I was walking around these large trade shows trying to convince people that, hey, mushrooms have been around in traditional Chinese medicine as a supplemental medicine, as a very healthy medicine. Would you like to put it into your product line? Growing mushrooms is expensive. It takes a lot of time. Every single mushroom has been picked by hand. There is no machine harvesting of mushrooms. So the millions, billions of these mushrooms that are go into the markets every year,
Mhm.
they have been picked by hand. So it's very expensive. Here's what happens is in the United States, you can grow mushrooms for food. You can make a profit doing that. So we have lots of fresh mushrooms in the market, but my products are sold dry as a dry powder. So if I sell that mushroom in the market for $10 a pound, a mushroom's 90% water. When you dry it out, now
Mm.
you have a tenth the amount. You have to sell that for $100. The economics for mushrooms as supplements, because of that, does not work out in the United States. And that's why, as a commercial mushroom grower and having worked in the business for 10 years back in the 70s, I realized that. And so I started taking trips to China. China is such an amazing place, and all of the small tens of thousands of small mushroom growers over there, and conferences and research institutes. They produce over 85% of the world's mushrooms. But one of the things was, okay, if I'm going to grow my mushrooms in China, I found and built relationships with farmers and processors over there. But I decided that, look, I have to grow these organically. So I brought the largest certifier of organic products in the United States. I brought them with me to China, 1997, and we held the very first organic certification workshop for mushrooms in China, 1997. 3 years later, we were starting to produce organic mushrooms. We grow our product way back in the mountains. Not only that, before they leave, we have to test them for pesticides. We test them for heavy metals. We test them for the microbiological panel. And then once they arrive in the United States to our warehouse there, we test them again. So they're tested twice. We are highly regulated when it comes to, okay, we have standards for heavy metals. We have standards for chemicals. We have standards for microorganisms. I cannot sell my product to any company unless I meet those standards, and they're all when they want to buy from me, they qualify me and my products before they even buy the product. We're certified by a high quality European certifiers.
Yes, definitely. And you know, now that I'm learning more about mushrooms, I'm encouraged to even consume more. And you probably know about this study that Dr. Michael Greger references and includes in his book, but he mentions that in Australia there was some researchers that took two groups. One group, they fed them a regular diet, and the other group was fed a regular diet along with a cup of cooked button mushrooms every day. And after a week, they noticed that those that were consuming the mushrooms had 50% boost in their IgA levels in the saliva. And the antibody levels remained elevated for a week before they dropped again, meaning that if you continue to consume, the antibody levels remain high. And that goes back to what you were talking about, the beta-glucans that are found in the mushrooms.
That's
And
correct.
it is amazing. And then he talks about another study where sometimes we talk about breast cancer and what things help fight or prevent breast cancer. So sometimes we think, you know, maybe it's the green tea or the soy found in the Asian women's diet. He mentions that we don't really talk so much about the mushrooms in their diet. Is it the soy or is it the green tea in conjunction with the consumption of mushrooms that help reduce the risk of breast cancer in Asian women?
You know, one of the things about these beta-glucans is that they have been studied very deeply for the last 40 to 50 years. And then they've done human studies, and they have shown that the mushrooms enhance our immune cells and strengthen our immune response. And they've got lots of tests that show how they will, in fact, activate our immune system and actually, in some cases in the animal studies, have shown complete remissions and high levels of inhibition. So it's pretty well established. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to tell you that the mushrooms are going to cure anybody's cancer. I don't make those kind of claims at all. But what I do say is that they've been used these days as what we call an adjuvant. So when people are going through regular therapies, they will use mushrooms to help maintain a higher level of immunity. And if you're not sick, well, then what you want to do, and this is something I really believe in, and that is prevention. And that gets back to diet and the kind of foods that we're eating, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a diet that prevents disease, that keeps us healthy, and mushrooms are part of that. And you cannot imagine the studies that have been done, and I saw one that came out just recently that looked at a very, very large population, and they did studies and found, I think it was coming from Singapore actually, and found that people who regularly ate mushrooms and had mushrooms in their diet lived longer than people who didn't.
Definitely. What about that unusual amino acid that's found in mushrooms? I think it's pronounced ergothioneine.
Ergothioneine, absolutely have. I mean, you know, it's interesting, and this is something that there is a researcher, Dr. Hollowell, in Singapore, who has been doing a tremendous amount of research with ergothioneine. It's a naturally occurring amino acid. We have it in all sorts of different places in our bodies. We don't produce it, and it is especially found into areas that have like red blood cells, liver, kidneys, so areas that come under a lot of oxidative stress. They find a lot of ergothioneine. And now mushrooms are one of the plants out there, a fungus of course, that have some of the highest levels of ergothioneine. You know, it's just so interesting, because the deeper we go, the more that we find out, ergothioneine and glutathione as well. So they are packed with these different healthful compounds. And that's just another basic indication to me of the tremendous value that mushrooms have for us, and just another reason to put mushrooms into our diet. So, in fact, what's interesting is I think that in the coming years, we're going to hear a lot more about ergothioneine, and they've even speculated that ergothioneine might be what they're calling a new vitamin.
Yes, that's fascinating. And I've seen people prepare some of the mushrooms depending on the flavors and the textures that they're looking for. I've seen another vlogger who I follow. She kind of introduced me to enoki.
I love enoki.
And by the way, I took one of your tips that you suggested, which was when you cook mushrooms, you cook them in a hot pan.
Yes, absolutely.
What a difference. My goodness.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I hear so often, especially from young people or their mothers who are just like, oh yeah, he doesn't like mushrooms because he says they're slimy. And I'm like, yeah, you are not cooking them properly. My mushrooms, when I cook them, are never slimy, and again, the hot pan with whatever oil that you prefer. I like to brown them. And I get so picky at times. And you know what? Remember too, when you're cooking mushrooms, they will shrink. You think you've got a lot in there and you go, oh my God, where'd they go? They will shrink. The issue is that with cooler pan, the water comes right out of them, and then they're sitting in a pool of water, and it's kind of like, I wasn't really wanting to make a gravy here. I wanted to use these mushrooms for something else. So the hot pan keeps the moisture in. You can kind of seal them off, the sides of them off, and brown them up. I'll turn them over, make sure both sides get brown. I like to cook them a little longer than maybe some. If I'm eating them just plain, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, wow, or I'll put them in whatever it may be. And that's what's so interesting about mushrooms, is that they're so versatile. And when you cook them properly, they've got a great texture. The flavor is locked in. I mean, you talk about enoki mushrooms. For people that aren't aware of enoki mushrooms come in kind of a vacuum packed package, and there's 1,000 mushrooms in there, and they have this very long, slender stem and a tiny little cap. And when you open them up, you just take them and you strip them down, you strip them apart, and then you cook them up. They are like crunchy. They've got the textures crunchy, and they are like noodles, like these beautiful noodles. They're so good. I love enoki mushroom.
The vegan YouTuber that I follow, she is Korean and she uses them often. Or where would we find them used the most? In what country?
I would say probably the cultivation of enoki started in Japan.
Okay.
And then the Koreans got into the picture, as did they in Taiwan, and they grow a lot of them in China as well. But Japan was really the starting place for that. And, I actually, this is what's interesting. When I was at the mushroom farm back in the 70s, where we were growing agaricus mushrooms, we had a Japanese scientist there, Dr. Urayama, and he was our director of research and development. He was growing shiitake mushrooms on wood logs. He was growing oyster mushrooms, and he was growing enoki mushrooms. So can you imagine, back in the 70s, I was eating these mushrooms. I had access to fresh enoki, shiitake, and oyster mushrooms in the 70s. I was so lucky. And as a mushroom grower by trade, ultimately, I learned about how to grow these other mushrooms. Because again, at that time in the 70s, nobody was growing these other mushrooms. We were at that particular farm. The owner was well ahead of the curve with these mushrooms. And a little funny story about that is our marketing director got special boxes. He started advertising. We put the fresh shiitake into the marketplace. It was there for 3 to 6 months. And then the news came back that, well, nobody's really buying them because the taste is too strong. And I was just shocked. I couldn't believe it, because to me, I mean, of all the mushrooms, shiitake is my favorite. It's got a heavenly flavor. You know, in China, they call it shanggu, which actually means fragrant mushroom. And it's got this taste and this odor that's just out of this world. In fact, when people ask me, well, what of these other mushrooms should I try? I say, eat shiitake mushrooms. Put it
Yes.
into your diet. Shiitake has got a very strong history as a medicinal mushroom too. So it's another one of those mushrooms that is going to be food as medicine. Eat shiitake.
Yes, definitely. And I travel with a bag of the dry ones, you know.
Oh, fabulous.
The flavor, like you said, the rich flavor is amazing. Speaking of the enoki, so we went to a restaurant, had the plant-based vegan option, and then a few days later, my husband's, describing this soup, this delicious meal that we had to someone else, and he says, "Honey, what is that one, the dish that had the pasta in it? It was so flavorful." And I'm thinking, no, we didn't have pasta. What are you talking about? I realized he was talking about the enoki that was in our soup that it was so hearty that it seemed like it was actually pasta.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Enoki in a soup, you think you're just eating a noodle or something, and the noodle is delicious, and you're going, wow, what is this? And if you look closely, because it's a long, slender stem, about maybe 6 inches long, and then you look closely, and it's got this little tiny cap on it. You're going, oh, that's actually a mushroom.
Yeah. When I buy the mushrooms fresh from the grocery store, how long could I expect for them to actually last in the refrigerator? And what's maybe the best way to store them?
Well, the best way to store them certainly is in a paper bag, because what that means is what you want to do is you want to keep them away from moisture. You don't want them to get wet, because if they get wet in your refrigerator, what's going to happen is then bacteria will grow. So the thing you want to do is keep them in a paper bag. And even at that, I mean, the thing about a button mushroom is that it's harvested at an immature stage. That's why it's called a button. So it has a much longer shelf life in your fridge. Whereas when you buy a shiitake, normally it's mature and it's opened up, and so the gills are all right there. So it has a little bit less of a shelf life in your fridge. Even in the paper bag, it will start to dry out. And let me just tell you something too. There's a lot of produce managers that do not know how to deal with mushrooms. I've gone into stores at times, and sometimes the mushrooms they're selling should be in the garbage bin. They are awful. They are, for example, if you see shiitake and you look at the gills should be nice and white. If you see a lot of brown spots on those gills, bacteria. If you see brown spots on your white mushrooms and the spot feels a little bit slimy, bacteria. So, I've seen oyster mushrooms that looked so ragged. I was shocked that anybody would leave these on the shelf. I felt like, I'm not going to go around every store and check and go, hey, okay, I'm the mushroom police here. You're selling mushrooms, should be in the garbage bin. But I swear, there's still not a lot of produce managers that really know how to handle mushrooms. For example, in some produce sections, they have these little sprayers going on, right? Well, just think about that for a second. If they happen to put mushrooms in the same place where they're spraying that water to keep all their veggies fresh, they're going to do exactly what you don't want them to do, which is to get these mushrooms wet. You can actually take the oyster mushroom and hold on to the gills, because the oyster mushroom is open, a lot of gill there, and you can just kind of pull, and you can kind of pull it apart into strips. And that's a great way to cook an oyster mushroom, and that also will strip the stem too, because the stem of an oyster mushroom is a little bit chewier than others, and so that's just a great way to do it. It's just to kind of like pull it apart.
Okay, and then since moisture is a concern when it comes to mushrooms, how do you feel about freezing them? Is that a bad idea?
Bad idea. The only way that you can actually freeze mushrooms properly is if you pre-cook them in whatever you're cooking, and then you can freeze the the dish or whatever, and that's okay. But normally, if you just freeze mushrooms, what happens is that they are 90% water. The cells will basically burst when you freeze them, and when you come out, you will have a just basically flat, soggy mess.
Oh my God. Well, that makes sense.
If you were to cook them up with, let's say you're prepping something and you're cooking a meal that you want to, have a couple of days later, something like that. Maybe you make a lot of it for dinner or something. The mushrooms part of it, sure, it's been cooked already. You can go ahead and freeze that meal.
Okay, this has been so informative. And what are you doing these days, Jeff? Are you traveling? Are you staying busy with your company?
Oh my God, Maya, you mushrooms have just all of a sudden they have arrived. Everybody now, there's articles written. Everybody and his brother wants to do something with mushrooms. It's like we have customers that are putting mushrooms with coffee. They're putting mushrooms in chocolates. There's so many different ways that people now are innovating with mushrooms, and it's just kind of exploded. I started out in the actual mushroom business in 1973. I've been eating mushrooms regularly ever since then, and love them, and would tell people about them and invite people for dinner and have mushrooms. And so I've watched this progression. I had to introduce mushrooms into the supplement industry because nobody had them in their product line, and nobody knew much of anything about them. So I've done a lot of education in the 90s. For me, when my company first started, was just nothing but education. I wrote articles, books, had just all sorts of information to try and basically tell people in the industry, hey, mushrooms are a great part of the supplement industry, besides being food, of course, but in terms of supplements, hey, they should be there. So yeah, today, I mean, we are so busy. The company has been expanding. I've got, in the last 2 years, 4 or 5 new employees. We're just, I'm really busy. The beauty of today's world, however, being as how I'm in Patagonia right now, is that, and talking to you, is that with my laptop, I can go almost anywhere in the world, and as long as there's a strong internet connection, I'm connected. I can continue to work. I happen to be in summer down here right now, right? So I'm leaving my British Columbia winter behind, and I'm down here in summer. And so I can go out fishing and enjoying the outdoors, which I really like, during the day, and then I can come back and I can work later on. And the time zone down here, I'm 5 hours ahead of my office. Works out very well. So that's kind of what I do.
You lightly touched on the combination of coffee and mushroom. Is that mushroom powder? Because that's kind of a new concept to me.
Well, you know what? There's one of our mushrooms that we have is called reishi, and it actually has kind of a bitter flavor. So it's reishi mushroom is not something that it's an edible per se. It's been used traditionally in a tea, but it's bitter. So think about, you're adding another bitter note to that coffee. And so that's where it kind of makes a very good match. And one of the things I do want to alert your audience to is the fact that when you're looking for genuine mushroom supplement, there's a lot of products in the market. We talked earlier a little bit about quality that are not actually mushroom. They actually grow the root system on grains, and then they sell you that root system, grain and all, and it turns out, there's no mushroom in the product at all, and it turns out to be mostly starch. So when you're looking for a mushroom product, one of the things that people should do is look to see if there's actually on the label, if it talks about the amounts of beta-glucan. One of the things that we do is that every single batch of our extracts that we make, we measure for beta-glucans. And then when we sell them, we say it has no less than 25% beta-glucan. So that's something you need to be aware of, because there are so many products out there that claim to be mushrooms that really aren't. So you have to be very careful.
Well, that's a very good point. Thank you for that tip, because that is the medicinal portion that we are looking for.
That's exactly right. And can you imagine if you bought a product and it turned out to be mostly grain starch?
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
You know what, the one thing I would say to people is just, again, put mushrooms into your diet. It's really the missing link. Start out with one, like a shiitake, try it out, see what you think, find the ones you like, try different ones. It's a wonderful world to enter into, and it's just such a great food. I highly recommend them.
What is the best way that our listeners can reach you?
Our website is nammex.com, Nammex.com. We've got a lot of information there, Maya, a lot of really good information that can help to educate people about mushrooms. And although we are a wholesaler and sell to other companies, we do have a retail line, and there's also a lot of good information on that website, and it's called realmushrooms.com.
Okay.
REAL mushrooms.com, and that's where we actually online will sell our products retail.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and touching base.
Thanks, Maya. Thank you again for having me.
You've been listening to the Plant-Based DFW podcast show. If you like our content, please like, share, and leave a review. Our goal is to provide quality episodes to help support the community.